The Gospel according to Luke, the 24th chapter. El Evangelio según Lucas, capítulo 24. Gloria a ti, oh Dios. At the crack of dawn on Sunday, the women came to the tomb, carrying the burial spices they had prepared. They found the entrance stone rolled back from the tomb, so they walked in. But once inside, they couldn't find the body of Jesus. They were puzzled, wondering what to make of this. Then, out of nowhere, it seemed, two beings, light cascading over them, stood there. The women were awestruck and bowed to the ground. The beings said, "Why are you looking for the living one in a cemetery? He's not here, but raised up. Remember how he told you when you were still back in Galilee that he had to be handed over to sinners, be killed on a cross, and 3 days rise up." Then they remembered Jesus' words. They left the tomb and broke the news of all this to the 11 and the rest. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them kept telling these things to the apostles. But the apostles didn't believe a word of it. They thought they were making it all up. La palabra de Dios. Gracias a Dios. Please be seated. They came expecting death. They came with spices to anoint Jesus' broken and brutalized body. They came defeated. They had lost. Empire had won. The leader of their movement had been executed, and they were all guilty by association. They came with shattered dreams, with their hopes for the future, with all they had worked for in their movement for years, crushed in what felt like a blink of an eye. They came expecting death. But when they got to the tomb, death wasn't there. Neither was life, however, which left them a little perplexed and confused, wondering what to make of this empty space between what they had known and what could not yet be known. You see, the resurrection had already happened. They just didn't know it yet. They didn't understand it yet. They hadn't put the pieces together yet of what Jesus had told them. They hadn't remembered that Jesus said he would rise up in 3 days. There they were in that dark, empty, tomb-like, womb-like space between death and life when, bam, out of nowhere, it seemed, two beings, light cascading over them, stood there. Divine messengers. And then what did they say to those women that was the turning point? for them that turned them from expecting death to celebrating life. What did they say? They said, remember. Remember. Remember how he told you when you were still back in Galilee that he would be handed over and crucified and raised up in 3 days, the messenger said. And as soon as they remembered, they got it. They knew it was true. They left the tomb and broke the news of all this to the rest of the disciples. For those women there in that empty tomb at the crack of dawn, the movement from expecting death to celebrating life, the movement from shattered dreams to new possibilities, from silent service to public proclamation, is not a matter of believing, it's a matter of remembering. Because once they remembered what Jesus said, suddenly what had seemed impossible became irrefutable. So thank God for women like Mary Magdalene and Joanna and all the Marys and all the unnamed women throughout the ages, still to this day, who remember and who refuse to silence themselves when the men around them refuse to listen to them. Amen to those women, many of whom are right here in this room. Amen. It was the remembering that made it all possible. Remembering, remembering. It's a powerful word. It's an even more powerful practice. Remembering, remembering from the Latin word membrum, which means limb. Remembering, reattaching the limbs to those who have been dismembered. Isn't that something? The opposite of remembering is not forgetting, it's dismembering. Separating the limbs, separating bone from bone until they are dry and lifeless and scattered over a barren landscape or cityscape. You might remember the story of the dry bones. It's a resurrection story that takes place long before Jesus' resurrection. We call it the story of the valley of the dry bones, but perhaps it is more accurate to call it the story of the remembering of the dismembered bones. Remembering of the dismembered community. The story is about Ezekiel looking out over a valley of dry bones, the bones of his people, his community. And God says to him, "Mortal, can these bones live?" And Ezekiel responds with the genuine, I don't know. And God says to Ezekiel, "Yes, you do know. Prophesy to those bones so that they may live." And Ezekiel does it. He speaks to those bones, and the bones begin to rattle, and one by one, the limbs start coming back together, start to be remembered. It was impossible, but it happened. That story has been weaving itself through conversations in this community for the last 6 months or so. First, Jane's vision of the bones arising in a random ad hoc strategy team meeting. Then Nancy reading that story from Ezekiel at the annual meeting. And then our beloved B. Gilmore, whose spirit accompanies us still, brought that story back in a word of hope and encouragement for this community that was feeling so dry and disconnected and beleaguered by this never-ending pandemic. Those words of B. Let's think about the dry bones. What was possible with the dry bones? They had all the parts there. And maybe if we take a look, we have all the parts here. Remembering. Many of us here today are members of Salt and Light Lutheran Church. Many of us here are members of Levin Community. Many of us are here are members of other groups and organizations. 2 years into this pandemic, when all our definitions and ideas of membership have been thrown into question and blown to pieces, when we've all been disconnected and dismembered in ways we don't even understand yet, what does it mean to remember? Member as a verb, not a noun. To member again, to re-up, to recommit, to re-engage as a member of a human community, a member of the whole community of creation. What does it mean to remember one another? To remember together. Remembering, reconnecting with one another and the sacred earth. Remembering is recalling the ancient stories, the deep wisdom, the core practices that can help us discern what to make of this empty and disorienting tomb-like, womb-like space we're in. Remembering is reconnecting limb to limb, bone to bone, because by God, we have all the parts here. And yes, these bones can live. Remembering is how we go from expecting death to celebrating life. But there's one last thing. There's no question that the work of remembering is ours to do. No one else can do it for us. Those divine beings reminded the women of what Jesus said, but the women themselves had to remember for themselves. The work of remembering is ours. But we are not the only ones remembering. We're not doing it on our own, and it's not all up to us, thank God. No, we are constantly being remembered by God. Constantly. Just as our bodies are constantly working for healing, just as the earth is constantly seeking balance and harmony, God is constantly reaching out, showing up, rattling the bones. It may not look like angels flooded in light or some kind of divine visitation, but God is alive and constantly remembering us, courting us, beckoning us, drawing us into deeper and deeper intimacy with others and with life, deeper and deeper communion with the risen Christ who is nowhere and everywhere all at the same time, whispering, I remember you. Be not afraid. You may be expecting death, but I'm here celebrating life. Do this to remember me. Amen. All right, how many remembers? How many? 30, 33, 34, 31? How many do you have? Did you lose count? There were so many? Yeah. Believe it or not, there were 37 remembers. Whoop, 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 whoop. All right. Well, thanks for listening. I'm so glad about that.